we're back in Ruby land, and this file here, it's pretty simple, right? All I'm going to do is just require a couple things, REST client, JSON, and pry. Who remembers what JSON is? Wow, very good. Oh, you didn't read it? Oh, nice, good job. Yeah, JavaScript object notation, right? And so what is JavaScript object notation, if you remember from the day one lecture? Yes, you're saying all the right things. Key value pairs, it's pretty generic, language agnostic. All right, what it is just, imagine you had to send a hash over the internet so JavaScript can understand it, except JavaScript thinks of it as an object. Right? If you write in Python, Python is just exactly the same. You'll have these two curly boys, and you will have some sort of key and some sort of value. I think C# as well. But if you were to send this data, and you wanted another language to understand it, you would first change it into JSON, and then you would parse that JSON on the other end with whatever language you're using. Cool? Sweet. So this is what this app does, right? You're all Ruby experts now. So I'm just going to talk through it really quickly. It's just going to print to the screen. I'm taking a quick nap. I'm going to run a function called sleep for 5 seconds. And then it's going to be like, great, I'm awake now. And then I'm going to make some sort of HTTP request. Who of you have done this REST client in your Mod 1 project, right? For those that haven't, all REST client does, and remember I'm requiring it right here as a gem, is it allows me to make HTTP requests in Ruby. So for example, the question would be, how would I have Ruby download information from Airbnb.com? That's a weird question to ask, right? But the browser, as you know from Mod 2, does a GET request, gets the HTML, and then renders it on the screen. If I wanted Ruby to do the same thing and get the data, get the HTML, I can run something called REST client. And then specifically, there are how many different sort of HTTP verbs that you're familiar with? Or what are they? The HTTP verbs. Right? Very good. So get, post, put patch, and delete. So here I'm doing what sort of action? Right. So in theory, what I'm doing is I'm getting information with REST client at this URL. So if I were to go to this URL, there should be no difference between hitting a GET request on Ruby and actually doing a GET request in my browser. Are you following so far? Thumbs up? Cool. So if I go here, I'm going to see what is cholesterol. For those that have watched Parks and Recreation, it's a character called Ron Swanson. Every time I refresh, it's going to give me a different quote. Okay? Okay, name me another one. Right? Cool. Straight down the middle, no hook, no spin, no fuss. Anything more than this becomes figure skating. Cool? So, all right, you guys don't like Ron Swanson. Got it. All right. Okay, should have changed this. Okay, thank you. So can you visualize what is supposed to be what comes back from this method call? Yes, no? Yeah, right? It's just going to be an array of one string. Cool? Great. And then it's going to say, hey, request is complete. And then I'm going to do some other stuff with it, some sort of JSON parse, which is I kind of alluded to. So Ruby is a synchronous programming language that reads top to bottom, left to right. And what it has is it has something called blocking that's built in. What that means is it will only execute one line at a time, one by one, and it will not read the next line or execute it until the previous line is done. Does that make sense? Cool. So if I were to run this, what do you think will happen? Well, just tell me what's going on in the application.
So it's going to print the string, take a quick nap, it's going to stop for 5 seconds, it's going to print, okay, I'm awake now, it's going to print, make an HTTP GET request, it's assigning the response from the REST printing again, rest is complete. It's parsing the original flow from the REST client through JSON and assigning it to a variable. It's printing to the screen, parsing the JSON response, and then it's printing the parsed code.
Any questions on that? It's pretty straightforward. Cool. So if I were to run it, and how would I run this Ruby file again? Ruby and then the file name, right? So here we have, it's just called sync.rb. So when I run this, what I'm going to see is, great, taking a quick nap, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it should say, great, okay, I'm awake now. And then it's going to print making the HTTP GET request. So far, so good, up to line 11. Then it did this REST client GET, saved it into a variable, and then I paused it with the binding. So here, let's take a look at what this is. Who has an idea of what this will be? Cool. It's a REST client response, which makes sense because what if I check the class of this? What would I get? Well, REST client.get should give me some sort of REST client object, right? That makes sense. And there it is. It's a REST client response object. Cool. Notice how it kind of alludes to what is in there, but it doesn't actually tell me what's actually in there. And so I would have to run json.parse of this object. Okay, I lost it for some reason. Because this is a REST client response, and as we know, it's coming through as JSON. So if I parse the JSON, now I'm going to actually get the object that I expect. Cool? And so this right here, when I parse the JSON, let me check the class, and I should see that it is an array with one string object inside. So far, so good? So the main tricky thing here is simply that when I run this REST client GET, I'm actually getting back JSON. Then I have to parse the JSON to get the value in which I'm really looking for. That's really the main takeaway here. Cool? Great. So if I were to get rid of this, let's not put it to sleep for 5 seconds, and I were to run that thing again, I don't have the binding pry, I don't have the 5-second wait, and so it's just going to run the whole thing. Oh my god. I should really filter this thing out. But either way, cool? Any questions on just the way Ruby does this sort of REST client? .get, parsing that JSON, and then actually getting the return value that we're looking for. Great. So let's see how JavaScript likes to handle this. First thing is, no, nothing here really. JavaScript does not have an organic sleep function, and so we just built one. All it is just function sleep. It takes in some sort of number. All right, I'm going to have a baseline of 0 here. And in this while loop, all I'm going to do is 12 to the 8th power times n, whatever n is, and then it's going to increment slowly. This is sort of going to create the same functionality as sleep in Ruby. Cool? So, what do you mean? Yeah. So the computer iterates very quickly, right? I don't know if you know this, but when a computer counts in computer time, like it'll just go significantly faster than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It'll go like that, but 20, 30, 40, 50 times as fast. So I needed an extremely large number for this while loop to kind of count through, to create the illusion of the sleep function.
But wouldn't that time that elapses when that sleep function is called change depending on the processing power of the computer?
That is correct.
So it's an arbitrary counter.
Oh, right. I thought you were saying that that's equal to 5 seconds.
No way, no. There's no organic sleep function. So I just wrote some arbitrary sleep function to create the illusion of this sort of blocking action. So a while loop in JavaScript is blocking. And what that means is it will not run the next line of code until this while loop is complete. Cool? So looks exactly the same, almost side by side. We have here this sort of console log starting the sleep function, right? So taking a quick nap. I'm going to run sleep. This should, I don't know, probably be about 5 seconds on my machine. And then it's going to say, wow, that sleep function took forever to run. 1 star, right? It's not a good look. You learned about events and you learned about click handlers, right? Tuesday. So can anyone give me an idea of what this will do? Just line 20.
When you click on something that has an ID of click button, the code.
Yeah, that's exactly correct, right? So let's take a look. I have in my HTML some sort of button with a click button ID. Let's take a look at what that is. So there it is, right? This is my HTML in all its glory. Any questions? No, right? Sweet. So what's going to happen here is it's just going to console log this, sleep, then console log this, and then this event listener gets added. In that order, top to bottom, left to right. What I should see is on refresh, I'm going to see starting the sleep function, and then wow, that sleep function took forever. 1 star. And then the click handler gets added. And it's listening. Cool? So, on refresh, listen for these mouse clicks, right? Because I'm going to click the button, and you tell me what is happening. Oh, did I not run the sleep? Oh, I didn't save it. Embarrassing. Cool. One more time, ready? Say again?
They're running at the same time.
Yes, so this is what's happening. Take a look at the code side by side so we can explain what's, we don't need this anymore, right? What's happening is, bluggle, 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 bluggle. Oh, I don't have spectacle running. Oh no, embarrassing. Cool. What the? Okay. All right, anyway. I log the sleep function. Then I run sleep, which is like arbitrarily like a few seconds, right? Wow, that sleep function took forever. Did you see this sleep function console log before or after this sleep function completed? Line 18, this, had to wait until this was done before it can execute. In the same way that while the sleep function was going, what happened here? All of my events did not fire until the sleep function was done. If you remember a long time ago, I keep saying a long time ago, but it was like maybe like 5-10 years ago. In terms of like the world time, it's not a lot. That who would go to like a website and then while it was loading, you couldn't scroll. Like it would have to like wait until it was finished loading and then you can scroll. Oh, what a time to be alive. Right? And it was because a lot of your code in the background was running before the interactivity was available. All these event handlers would fire on your website. So even the scrolling would wait. Like an image would load and you couldn't scroll until the image finished downloading. right? Yeah, it was, my God, the 90s were a rough time. We made it okay, though. So this is known as blocking, right? And this does not lead to what I think we can all agree on is a good user experience, right? Like if you had blocking code, do you think that your website would be a good user experience sort of website in terms of the functionality of your website and the look and feel of it when your users are using it? Like, no, right? Absolutely not. It's trash. So what we want to do is we want to do something in the background. What we want to happen is, let's say this sleep function was doing something, not just literally sleeping, right? It actually, I don't know, made a GET request and got data from a server in the background. Do you remember like when I showed you Twitter, Coffee Dat, and Airbnb? When I'd scroll to the bottom, it would make a what? Make a GET request, get some more data, and then what? It would append it to the screen, as you know. And so, do you think that it would be a good user experience that while it's doing that GET request, everything else stops on your website? Oh, it'd be terrible, right? It's terrible. So, naturally, JavaScript was like, great, if I'm going to do these GET requests, I'm going to do all of these extra network requests on the side, it must be hidden from the user, and it must be non-blocking. And so naturally, Ajax was born. Ajax stands for what? Does anyone know? Yeah, so async, right? JavaScript, and something called XML. XML is another markup language, right? Literally, ML stands for markup language, and X stands for extensible. In the same way that HTML is written, hypertext markup language, is written the same way, right? So you'd have something like a header, and then like your data right here, and then it would close the header. And then you would just do something else, right? Like let's say you were getting data about a book, it'd be like a title, and it'd be like 100 Years War, something like that, and then it would end title. And then great, who's the author? It would be like author, just like your boy, I don't know who wrote this book, and then author. Notice how, if you had to send XML across the internet, how much extra data are you sending when you have to send this, and this, and this, and even this sort of header? Wouldn't it be nice if you could just send something like this? Header is this data, right? A little comma action, and then the title is something like 100 Years War, right? And then the author is me. Thank me, word, right? That is so much smaller, shorter, and cleaner than having to do this. You can imagine if I had to send 20, 30, 40, 50 lines, it winds up being obnoxious, right? XML still exists today. There are reasons for that I won't get into today, but this right here looks like what to you? It's like, yeah, some sort of object hash, looks like JSON, right? And so what we do now is we typically send, most of the time, JSON back and forth from the server to the client. All right? Do you understand like why that kind of came to be and why this is sort of making sense? Cool. So the way we write it, right, instead of like this REST client.get, we do something called fetch in JavaScript. And what do you think fetch takes as an argument, right? You looked at the docs a little bit. It takes that URL. Luckily for me, I got it here. Cool. So I have the URL right here. In the same way that REST client needs to know, where am I getting this data? What am I doing this GET request on? So far, so good? I'm going to just open this up a little bit so you can kind of see it. Okay. Oh, come on. There we go. Give me that. Chris Brown. So, in this fetch, right? Is this fetch being invoked right now? Okay. Is there a difference between this and this? Okay. Is this fetch being invoked right now? Yes. It's being invoked, right? The bananas. Just because they're far apart doesn't mean that they're not there. Cool? So remember, what is this again, 26? It's a reference to the function fetch. Cool? And so, who has seen this before? Console log. Is this being invoked, or is it a reference to the function? It's a reference, right? So what's happening here is I'm passing a reference to a function rather than invoking it immediately. You'll learn more about this as you get experience with JavaScript, but if I invoke it immediately, it will just actually run. It will not wait until this click. It'll just read this line, and JavaScript goes, oh great, invoke this function, and it'll trigger. Cool? So I pass a reference to a function as a callback because I need to invoke it later. Whenever this click happens, then I run the reference to this function.
How does that console log know what content to like log in the console if you don't sort of feed it anything like you ordinarily would with others?
That's a very, very good question. And earlier in in week 1, day 1, we talked about callbacks. And callbacks is a reference to a function. They will be receiving arguments. Do you remember when I did the do-it-yourself, like .map or .each? And then inside there was a callback that got called with arguments. This takes a lot of time to wrap your head around. I will go more in-depth into this, but I don't have the time in this lecture. But I promise I will do it in the afternoon's lecture. We don't need to fully understand callbacks right now, but I will go into it in the afternoon's lecture because you'll need it, and because like I'll actually be referencing it. Here, I have to spend more time on the event loop. Is that fair? Cool. So, is that a hand? Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. All right. So, this fetch, right? What does this look like in terms of what you know in terms of functions? There's a special word. It's an argument, right? Like I'm just passing in the argument of a URL inside this fetch request. Cool? Don't feel bad because the questions are generally open-ended like this. And it's like, great, what is he asking for? I'm not really sure. Don't be frustrated. I'm just trying to sort of get your mind to thinking of the terminology and the vocabulary so you get used to it. So when I point out things in this like open-ended fashion, you should be able to, hopefully by the end of Mod 3, be like, great, that is an argument. That's a callback. I'm talking about lexical scope and like just saying these things out loud, right? So don't feel bad. It's a lot to take in. It's okay. So I could pass in 2 arguments, and this will be argument number 2, right? If I just put a comma inside. Please do not put in comma outside and think you're putting in argument number 2, right? It's a rookie move. So what do you think the second argument for this fetch request would be? If I have a URL, right, what am I doing with that URL? Am I doing which HTTP action? Right, exactly. I'm doing a GET request. So naturally, I would have to specify the method here, and here I'm specifying GET as the second argument, right? Yeah?
Why do you need to specify? Does it fetch imply that you're like fetching something from that URL?
100%. 100%.
Is there a reason you need to specify?
On a technicality, absolutely not. I never need to specify GET for a fetch, and that's a very good point. I'm simply introducing to you that fetch can take a second argument, and that possibly this might change. Right? You can post, patch, put, and delete with fetch. Right? If you leave this out, it will assume GET. Cool? But this is like, again, you're in like a classroom setting. I'm like trying to teach you. So I'm just alluding to the fact that it can take more than this. Right? Very good question. And thank you. Right? because it makes sense. That's like a question that would come up in my mind. Like, why were you specifying get? Because it isn't fetch mean get, right? But in fact, fetch is really weird. JavaScript's weird in a lot of ways. And so one of the things is you'll have to tell it what to do, but get is the default. So you will not have to pass in this method get if you're just doing the get request. Cool? We will talk this afternoon about post, and then tomorrow I will teach you patch and delete because they deserve their own lecture. Cool? So first thing I want to do is I want to do const, right? Fetched data. And I just want to see what is this, right? I can always just drop a quick log and say what is fetched data. So far so good. I put these spaces so you can see them a little better, but you don't need to. Great. Let's take a look. Oh great, I can get rid of the sleep function. Embarrassing. Cool. It returns a promise. A fetch returns a promise. There's a couple really bad jokes that never get any laughs, but something you should remember is a promise goes on forever and never break a promise. Cool? Someone also always makes fun of that. Yeah. All right, so check it out. So we know fetch returns a promise, right? How do I get the data outside of this sort of promise object? We could take a look at the promise and see that it was resolved, which is great. And there's some sort of like response, right? Here we have okay, true, I did not get redirected, status 200. What does this really mean, status 200? Like, yeah, the request was okay, it was good to go, right? Status okay, cool. This is the actual URL I went to. And then I can dig into like all these methods that I can call on it, right? Cool. So we know that, absolutely, we know that it's asynchronous, right? We talked about why we want these requests to happen in the background. And so naturally, I would have to wait until this fetch returns with the data, and then I should do something with it, right? There is a special method called .then, which works on promises, and that is, it is going to wait until this thing comes back. The promise is done, and then it's going to do something. And what it is it's going to take in a function, because the then needs to know what to do. So I'm just going to give it a function. And this function is going to get what from this fetch? It's going to receive the data that comes back from the fetch, right? So in here, this function is going to expect to receive some sort of data. And all I want to do right now is just console log the data. I'm going to clean this up here in a little bit, but let's take a look. Cool. I have some sort of response object. I have a response object. It looks pretty similar to the promise object, but it's different. It is the response object. It came back from the fetch. Cool. So the promise object is just the return value of the fetch. The response object is the fetch finished and gave me back a response. This response, however, is in JSON. So let's take a look at this. Oops. Let's take a look. Is this a little bit easier to read? Right? Great. I have a console log and I have the data here. What did we do with that Ruby REST client? We parsed it, right? Here, I can do data.json and then invoke this function. So now I can console log the data. I'm sorry. Let's do this, right? Parsed data equals to this. And then I'm just going to console log the parsed data. Cool? Any questions so far?
Just in our function, you're passing in data, but we don't define that anywhere else. How, just to be clear for my sake, how, how does the then function know that that data is meant from get whatever it is?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, absolutely. So do you remember method chaining in Mod 1? And how probably Mike was like, don't do it, it's bad. Don't be fooled by the spaces and the white space. I'm literally chaining on .then to the fetch. So I'm just putting the space here as sort of a easier to read. I'm literally adding .then to this method. So the fetch, I'm gonna guess that. No, you're good. So the fetch gives me back a promise, right? I promise I'm gonna give you some data. But I have to wait until that request is actually done. Who's here started their Rails server and then be like, great, come on, spin up, spin up, spin up. Like you did Rails S, and then you went straight to the website, localhost 3000/awesome, and then it was like, great. And you're just like waiting for the response to come back, and then finally it all loads, right? The response sometimes can take longer than 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds, and we don't know how long that's gonna take. We wanna make sure that when the data comes back, we then do something to it. And that has to do with the event loop, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Yeah.
Why doesn't JavaScript automatically insert a semicolon when you make that then a new line? Like how does it know that this is changed and not a separate method function rather?
Oh, why does it not add this?
Well, if I saw that without a semicolon, I would assume because it's on, I put the then on a new line, that JavaScript will automatically insert a semicolon after the fetch line.
Are you talking about like it would automatically try to add a semicolon here?
Yeah. Like why
So-
are they connected?
So there are a lot of rules to the semicolon, automatic semicolon insertion. And one of them is specifically if you see a particular function, especially if you're adding like your method chaining, it will only add a semicolon after an expression. Here, this is being invoked, right? That becomes really deep into automatic semicolon insertion, and that is a great blog post for you to look into if you're interested.
So just double check, since we're method chaining, in the function data, we're passing in the fetch once it's finished loading into the argument of data in the function.
One more time, sorry.
So since we're method chaining,
Yeah.
the argument of data is equal to the promise that we get, right?
Not exactly, but you can think of it that way. So what he said was, this data is going to be sort of like the promise of this fetch, right? I say think about it that way because this data is actually going to be whatever the return value of data from the fetch. The fetch will always automatically return a promise, and I'll get to that. The data here is what happens after the fetch completes. So the fetch will run, it will take some time, and then when the fetch comes back with the data, it will pass it automatically into that first function. And so we can use this as an argument. It could be anything, like this is just some sort of placeholder. This is an argument. Right, this is exactly a callback, correct. This function is a callback in the .then. Any questions so far? Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Great. So let's take a look at what this returns, right? Oh, I'm sorry. It returns a response. What do we do in Ruby with this response object, this REST client.get? We parse the data, and now I'm going to console log. So now we have this resolve promise again, and yet we have an array of one object, and in that it's the parsed data. So a .then, I see your question, and a fetch, they will always return a promise. A .then will return a promise, a fetch will return a promise. You can see that right here. When I console log the parsed data from the .then, I am getting back a promise. Yes?
Why does it say
Pending?
like promise?
In here, it's Okay.
Is that too much?
It is too much. The easiest way I can describe it is when the browser first gets it, it's technically pending, but it will resolve like literally immediately. So like even if you like value below is evaluated just now, so it returns a promise.
It
And when
just
I
tells you that it's pending because before you get your response.
yeah,
It's getting the response.
exactly. All right. So fetch returns a promise. .then is a special method that you can execute on promises to wait until the return value is good. Notice how earlier in the lecture I said that we can parse the JSON like this. What if it didn't come back as JSON, but instead we had regular old text, right? I want to open your mind to the fact that we send data, different types of data across the internet. Most of the data that you'll be dealing with when it comes to APIs will be some sort of text or JSON. So for 90-something% of the time here, this will work, but I do not want to see a pattern where you automatically assume that it's JSON, and then when I ask you, why did you do that? And you're like, I don't know, but it worked. Like that's not the correct response, right? It should be the data that I get back from the fetch is in JSON, and I need to parse the JSON so that I can now utilize that data. That would be an acceptable response.
So if it returns XML, is that when you would use text?
Yeah, I would use something else to parse it. Cool? So like there's CSV files that you're aware of, like comma separated values, and so I would not .json that, all right? What would I do? I would look at the docs and then figure out how would I parse that. Cool? So, great. Unfortunately, this is a promise. And with that, what is a very special method you may or may not have heard about that I can run on a promise to get sort of that value? We can run a certain method called .then. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it works on promises. Okay, that joke didn't land. Thank you. And so this .then, all right, will receive, will receive the return value from this .then into here. Cool? So this first then simply is utilized to convert the data to something that we can use. And here I should be getting the return value of this function. Cool? So this is going to be the parsed data object that I'm getting from this .then. This right here is going to be the return value of this .then.
So you'll always use two dots.
Not always, but most of the time, all right? So parse data object. I'm naming this because I'm just trying to be clear about what this is. All right, you can name it whatever you want. Like right now, I know that it's going to be a string or an array of a string, all right? But for here, just for sort of explanation purposes, this is going to be the parse JSON object because you parsed it here. So let's log it to see what comes up. Undefined. Why would something come back undefined in JavaScript? There's no return. So this function doesn't return anything. Notice what I was saying earlier, and I said it like 3 times. This parse data object will be the return value of this function. Cool? So simply return the parse data. Cool? And now this function will receive the return value of this function. For those that like look down to take a note, all I did was refresh. And so now you can see the log here because this returned data. Are there any questions so far on this parse data object being the return value of this first .then, which we used to simply parse the JSON? Yeah?
Then is always acting on whatever the previous then is giving it.
Correct. Then will always act on the previous then. So we here now have the array that we were looking for, right? We have the exact object that we want. What I can do is I can then again function, all right? And I can just console log, all right? And what does this return me? It returns nothing. So return value from last then. Cool? So what will I expect to see? Undefined. Great. I can just return, I don't know, hot dog if I wanted to. What should this be? And then if I wanted to, I can then again, because promises go on forever. Right? Let me ask you this. Do I need this dot then? Because I had the data I wanted here already. Sometimes I'll like look at someone's code and there'll be like 4 thens and I'm like, cool, why did you do that? And like, I don't know. I'm like, interesting. And that's nothing wrong with it. It's just I need you to understand why you're writing something, right? You have to be specific. And you could test every step of the way. So because I had the data I needed already, there no longer needed to be a requirement to add another dot then. Cool? Yeah?
So if for the first dot then we're returning parse data, I guess instead of the promise, right? If it's that we're writing return with parse data for the first one.
No, I'm just returning it. I'm literally...
So the first one is still...
The first one is still the response object. I'm parsing it, saving it into a variable, and then returning the variable so that my next dot then has access to it.
But that first one no longer returns the promise, it's returning parse data.
Yeah.
So would you need this second one? Could you just act on the first one to get
I cannot know because the dot then, right, this dot then will receive the return value of this, but this itself is a promise.
Do we have to save that variable? Can we just return data.json?
You can return data.json. This is just, again, I'm explaining to you, so I'm trying to break it down to lines. It's a very good question. You can, in fact, just return data.json. And we will do a quick refactor right now. No. This is just me like explaining to you what's going on. Actually, pop quiz, what would happen if I left this?
Now it's going to be bad.
What?
Return first value.
It returns the first value, right. So in 27, it'll be like, oh, cool, return. And it'll be like, what's 28? Don't care, returned already. Cool? Yeah, it'll just be like, whatever, dude. And then just roll out. Because the first return returned. Returns will break out of the function. Cool? And there it is. Okay? Cool. Right, so any questions on how to use fetch and using this second dot then? This first dot then is just sort of parsing, and now I have the access. Now I have the object that I'm looking for from this fetch. All right, pretty straightforward.
So the variable that you're passing into the second dot then function can be called whatever you want it to call.
Yeah, I can call it whatever I want. Right? I mean, look, I can just name this Gabby if I wanted to. It'll work. Look. Huh? Well, I don't know. I just like to make it a little more interactive. So if let's just change that. Sure. Very good. So pop quiz, right? We learned about this fetch, and I don't have a lot of time, but I want to make sure something is important here. This right here is very obviously, I spell whatever, before the fetch. Cool? Any questions? Any questions on that? Cool. And this is very obviously after the fetch. As we have learned, JavaScript runs top to bottom, left to right. In what order will I see this console log, and this console log? It should be before, after, and then the fetch. Cool? Before, after, and then the fetch. Notice the lines, 25, 35, 31. This is the first time you will start to encounter the fact that just because the order in which you write something does not mean that it will be executed and returned in that order. This is very important. One more time, if you want to take notes, just because you wrote it in this order does not mean it will execute and return in the same order.
That's because the middle function takes more time to process.
100% exactly correct. I'm going to try to explain the event loop in about 5 minutes, and then we'll break. Cool? So I have to lecture on Sinatra. All right, so check it out. This is JavaScript, right? Right? There's something called a stack. Who's heard of like the call stack, right? Does anyone know what the call stack is?
It's like all the things and tasks that it has to do.
Exactly. It's all the tasks that have to be executed. So they call it a stack because it is, in fact, a data structure known as the stack. A stack, whatever. Right? Versus a data structure like, God bless you, like array or hash or string as data structures, right? Or like linked lists. So here, think of the stack as sort of pancakes, right? You can only eat the top pancake. Unless you remove the top pancake, you cannot eat the second or third pancake. So far, so good. Are there any questions on that? Right? So, here's how it works. JavaScript will first start to run your code. The first thing it does is this G is called global. It is the global execution context for your application. Meaning, the second it sees line 1 and it literally reads this comment called nothing, it would go, great, I'm going to execute the comment nothing. The global execution context is this whole thing. So far, so good? Meaning, the global execution context will be done at line 36. Does that make sense? Ignore all this like commented code here. It would be done at 36. The global execution context completes at line 36. Are there any questions on that? The global execution context finishes at the end of the last line of code you are running. So, the first thing it sees is the global execution context. It will, remember, it's a two-parter, right? First time is reading all the code, putting everything in memory. The second time is the execution. I am talking about part 2, execution. So part 2, great. I've already defined this function in memory from part 1 of execution. I can ignore that. More comments, cool. Great. A log function. Is this function being executed or invoked? Great, yes, absolutely. So first thing I'm going to do is, right on this call stack, put the console log. Did this log return anything? Well, it returns undefined, right? Also, it logs something to the screen. Cool, great. It returned undefined, it finished executing, pops off the stack. So far, so good? Let's bring this sleep back. The next thing is it's going to see this and be like, okay, great, a sleep function. Very cool. Where is sleep written? Oh, I have it in memory on line 4. I'm going to create another variable, right? It's going to do that whole read phase again. It's going to create this variable I in memory, and then it's going to see a while loop. Great. And then part 2, within the execution context here, it's going to execute. Now it's going to assign the value of I to 0, and it's actually going to run this while loop. So the while loop gets put on the stack. So far, so good. The while loop is now on the stack. Great. The while loop is going to count to 1,000,000, or whatever this number is. And then the while loop completes. It's done. When the while loop is done, it pops off the stack. And so the while loop is done, it pops off the stack. Great. The whole function is now done. There's nothing else after this. It doesn't also do some cool stuff here, right? There's nothing else in this function. So the function is now done. That sleep function will now pop off the stack. And now we are at this log because the sleep just finished. So the next log gets put on the stack. It console logs, returns undefined, returns, and therefore pops off the stack. So far, so good. Do you understand how JavaScript is running your code in this sort of stack-like environment? The stack data structure, cool? So, do you see how this while loop prevented this log from going? Because this had to finish before the next log started. So far, so good. All right, let's get crazy. It's going to add this event listener, right? So it's going to add the event listener and then pop off the stack once the event listener has been added. Yeah.
Sorry, one question. How does it determine when it should start popping off the stack before it starts stacking again?
Does anyone know?
If the queue is empty,
It knows to pop off the stack when the function is complete. Cool? Whenever it's done. I keep saying return because return will complete the function, right? Or it will just run to the last line, and then if you forgot the return, it'll go undefined, and it'll be like, okay, cool, I'm done, and then roll out. Make sense? Awesome. So it will log before the fetch, right? Boom, console log pops on here. It logs this very, very cool statement, and then pops off the stack. Here's what happens with fetch. Fetch will come on the stack. If this fetch was synchronous and blocking, it will wait until this is done before it hits this log. Does everyone agree with that statement? If this was synchronous, it will run this code, run the fetch to completion, and then log. Does that make sense? However, fetch is asynchronous. And in order to create this asynchronous illusion, remember, I cannot hit this console log until this fetch comes off the stack. Right? Who agrees with that statement? I cannot hit the next log until the fetch comes off the stack. So, what does fetch do? It comes on the stack and then immediately returns a promise and comes off the stack. That's right. It will just come on the stack and go, great, fetch, return a promise, and pop right off the stack. The next thing that comes across is the console. So then you see this, you see some sort of return, and then, you see some sort of promise, and then you see the next log. So where does the fetch go? When the fetch comes on here and returns a promise, it pops off. It goes into what is known as the event loop. All right, this is like terrible, sorry. It goes into the event loop. The event loop is handled by the browser, and it will do the GET request for you on the sly, and then it will go into what is known as, so the event loop, all right, it will do its like request. It's dirty over here. And then when it is done, it pops into what is known as an event queue. So cool, data from the fetch. Ready? Fetch comes on, returns a promise, pops off, goes into the event loop. Then the rest of your JavaScript will run because the stack is now clear. The event loop will take it, run the API, run your GET request, do whatever you ask it to do. Once it is done, it hits the event queue. In here, this listens for the call stack. The event queue is extremely polite and does not play cutsies. It will not jump the line, and it will wait until the call stack is clear. Once the call stack is clear, it goes, oh, great, you're not busy. Take the fetch from before and put it on. And now, guess what runs? .then. And this will run after. 100%. Yes.
When it comes to having multiple fetches, would it just be in the order which you have your fetch?
No.
No.
No. That's a very good question. Let me answer that right now. If I had 4 or 5 fetches, fetch pops on, returns a promise, and then immediately goes where? Event loop, right? Remember this is getting really messy here. But if I had a fetch go on, return pop off, a fetch go on, return pop off, a fetch go on, return pop off, in this event loop that is taking care of the API of doing the get, the post, the patch, which one comes back first? Whichever one finishes first, and then goes into the event queue. Then it waits until this is done, and then in that order, fetch 1, fetch 4, fetch 3, then fetch 2. Whatever order it came back will then execute in that order in the way it comes back. The problem now is, what if data from 2 you need for 3, but they're in the wrong order? That is a much different lecture, way, way more complicated, and we will not get to that. Just understand the event loop, how that's happening. And so, when is the global execution call stack complete? Line 36. 36 finishes, so you see this log first, then the .then runs. You see it parsed, and then it logs. Are there any questions as to the event loop, asynchronous JavaScript, how your JavaScript is running, and why this and this log before this? Great, that's all I have for you today.